Before we start, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. Share, like, and be the first to know when new stories dropped. Now, let's start. It was a sharp, final sound that cut through the low hum of the city. The echo bounced off the narrow brick walls, bouncing back and forth until it was swallowed by the relentless downpour. There was no traffic here. No neon glow reached this deep into the concrete throat of the alley. Just the rhythmic drip of water hitting rusted pipes, and the suffocating weight of the dark. Every shadow seemed to stretch, deepening the sense of being cut off from the world outside. The air tasted of ozone and damp soot. It was a place designed for things to be forgotten, a narrow corridor, where the city's noise was muffled into a dull, distant roar. The metal door did not rattle. It stayed locked, a solid barrier of iron that turned the alley into a dead end. Silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against the ears with a physical force. A shadow detached itself from the brickwork. Kofi stepped into the center of the alley, his head bowed against the deluge. Water streamed down his face, tracking through the deep lines of his features. He did not look at the street lamps or the distant glow of the city. His focus was singular. He clutched the frame to his chest, hunching his shoulders to create a dry pocket for the surface of the canvas. His knuckles were white, pressed hard against the wood. He stopped and tilted the frame, checking the edges for moisture. A smear of dried acrylic flaked off his thumb and vanished into the gutter. He breathed in, a sharp, ragged sound that hitched in his throat. His hands were mapped with permanent stains, the pigments of his work embedded in the skin of his palms. He stood motionless for a moment, letting the rain soak through his layers, indifferent to the cold. The canvas was the only thing that mattered. He adjusted his grip, shielding the image from the wind, and took a slow, deliberate step forward. The neon lights of Seoul flickered at the mouth of the alley, casting long, vibrating streaks of electric blue and harsh magenta across the wet pavement. Kofi stood at the threshold, but he did not cross it. He held the canvas tighter, pressing the wooden frame against his chest until the edges bit into his skin. To the commuters rushing past the alley entrance, he was just another ghost in the rain, a smudge of darkness against the brick. He watched them move in blurred lines of motion, their faces illuminated by the glow of handheld screens, eyes fixed on paths he did not share. He was a stranger here, a man without a map, tethered only to the weight of the work in his arms. The canvas acted as a shield, a solid, tangible truth in a city that seemed to look right through him. He felt the vibration of the subway rumbling beneath the ground, a low-frequency hum that rattled his teeth. He shifted his weight, turning his back on the light. The city was a machine of glass and electricity, indifferent to his presence. He retreated, step by slow step, into the deeper dark where the neon could not reach, keeping his grip firm on the only thing that proved he existed. The heavy metal door clicked shut, sealing out the damp chill of the alley. Inside, the air was thick, smelling of linseed oil, turpentine, and stale coffee. Kofi stood in the center of the room, listening to the silence. It was not empty. Dozens of faces stared back at him from the walls, their eyes captured on canvas with frantic, precise strokes. He navigated the cramped space, stepping over stacks of primed frames and jars of dried brushes. He reached the easel, the wood creaking under his touch, and carefully propped his new canvas against the others. He looked at the eyes he had painted wide, hollow, searching, and saw the same exhaustion he felt in his own bones. He moved to the desk, clicked on a single lamp, and was surrounded by the city's unspoken stories. The rhythm of the night shift was a brutal, mechanical grind. Kofi stood at the industrial sink, his back aching as he plunged his hands into scalding, soapy water. He scrubbed plates until the grease vanished, his skin turning red from the heat and the harsh chemicals. Every movement was a repetition of the last, a cycle of steam and noise that drowned out his thoughts. He looked down at his palms. The skin was thick, calloused from years of labor, yet the tips of his fingers remained stained with permanent traces of cobalt blue and burnt sienna. These hands performed two lives. By night, they battled the grime of a commercial kitchen, gripping heavy ceramic and scouring metal. By day, they held brushes, with a feather-light touch, layering pigment onto canvas to capture the fleeting expressions of strangers. He wiped his hands on a rag, the fabric catching on the rough skin. He finished the last stack, turned off the faucet, and stepped out into the quiet, pre-dawn air. The studio was quiet, save for the rhythmic scratch of a dry brush against coarse fabric. Kofi leaned into his work, his breath steady, his focus entirely on the curve of an eye he was trying to capture. He had forgotten the world outside. He had forgotten the city. Then, the silence shattered. A sharp, metallic chime rang out from above the door, vibrating through the small room. It was a sound that did not belong here. Kofi froze. His hand hovered inches from the canvas, the brush still dripping with wet pigment. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the doorframe. The handle turned with a heavy, deliberate click. The wood groaned as it swung inward, letting in a sliver of light from the hallway. He set his brush down on the edge of the desk. He stood up, his spine stiffening, his pulse quickening against the sudden intrusion. He braced himself, waiting to see who had crossed the threshold. The door swung wide, hitting the stop with a dull thud. A woman stepped across the threshold, her movements precise and measured. She did not look around the room at first. She simply stood there, a sharp, composed figure against the backdrop of the chaotic, paint-splattered studio. Kofi took a half step back, instinctively pulling his hands behind his back to hide the fresh acrylic stains on his palms. The air in the room seemed to thin. She carried a scent of rain and cold air that cut through the heavy, stagnant smell of turpentine and drying oil. She looked at the floor, then at the rows of canvases stacked against the brick walls, her gaze scanning the space with an intensity that made Kofi feel exposed. He watched her feet move across the uneven floorboards, each step deliberate. She stopped near the center of the room, the light from the single overhead bulb catching the sharp angles of her posture. She did not speak. She simply stood, her presence filling the small studio, turning his private sanctuary into a space that suddenly felt too small, too crowded, and entirely changed. The silence between them stretched, heavy and expectant, as she finally turned her head to look at him. She ignored the clutter and walked deeper into the studio. Her eyes moved from one canvas to the next, passing over landscapes and abstract shapes without a pause. Kofi held his breath, his back pressed against the workbench as he watched her progress. Then, she stopped. She stood motionless before a canvas tucked into the corner, a portrait of a woman with head bowed and eyes closed. The brushwork was heavy, layered with deep shadows and muted tones. She did not look at Kofi. She stared only at the painted face, her head tilting slightly to the side. The air in the studio grew dense. She took a slow, shallow breath that seemed to catch in her throat. Her shoulders dropped, losing their rigid composure. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from the surface of the painting, tracing the lines of the weeping figure. Her fingertips made contact with the wooden frame. The wood was rough, worn by time and the humidity of the studio. She did not pull away. Instead, her hand pressed harder against the edge, and her fingers began to tremble. It was a rhythmic, involuntary shaking that traveled from her knuckles up to her wrist. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the surface of the painting. She traced the outer border of the canvas, her touch lingering on the jagged texture where the paint had dried thick and uneven. The tremor in her hand grew more pronounced, a silent vibration that seemed to bridge the distance between her own stillness and the sorrow captured in the portrait. She gripped the frame firmly, her knuckles turning pale under the pressure. She was not just looking at the image, she was anchoring herself to it. Every muscle in her forearm tightened as she held the frame, her gaze locked onto the painted eyes. She stood there for a long time, the only movement in the room the slight, persistent shaking of her hand against the wood. The connection was absolute. Kofi remained in the deep shadow behind the stack of drying canvases. He did not move. He barely dared to blink. From his vantage point, he watched the way she held the frame, her posture shifting from guarded to completely vulnerable. He saw the way her gaze traveled across the brushstrokes, tracing the exact spots where he had labored over the eyes and the curve of the jaw. A sudden, sharp realization hit him. She was not just observing a painting. She was reading the story he had hidden in the layers of pigment. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thudding that echoed in the quiet room. He felt a surge of heat rise in his chest. For years, he had been a ghost in this city, his work ignored, his presence invisible to the neon-lit crowds. Now, someone was finally looking at his soul. He shifted his weight, his boot scraping slightly against the floorboards. He froze, terrified of breaking the spell. But she did not turn. He pressed his hand against his own chest, trying to steady his breathing, overwhelmed by the sudden, undeniable proof that his work mattered. Hana finally pulled her hand away from the frame. She turned, her eyes meeting the dim light of the studio, and spoke a single, clear sentence. "I want to buy this." The words hung in the air, cutting through the stagnant dust. Kofi stepped out from the shadows, his legs stiff from hours of crouching. He moved toward her, his movements hesitant. She did not wait for him to name a price. She reached into her bag, pulled out a stack of bills, and placed them on the scarred wooden table. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was sharp, final. Kofi reached for the canvas, his calloused fingers brushing against her pale skin as he lifted it from the easel. The weight of the painting felt different now. It was no longer just a burden of paint and cloth, but a bridge. He wrapped it in brown paper, his hands steadying as he taped the edges. She took the package, clutching it to her chest with both arms. She nodded once, a quick, sharp motion, and walked toward the door. The heavy metal latch clicked as she exited, leaving Kofi standing alone in the center of the room. He looked at the money on the table, then at the empty space on the easel. The silence of the studio had changed. It was no longer empty, but expectant. The silence returned after she left, but it felt different now. It held a shape where her presence had been. Kofi spent the rest of the day scrubbing dishes until his knuckles turned white, expecting the moment to fade like a dream. He locked the studio door at dusk, convinced he would never see her again. But the next morning, before he could even sweep the floor, the latch clicked. The door pushed open. Hana stepped inside, shaking rain from her umbrella. She did not speak. She simply walked to the corner. She stood there for an hour, watching the drying paint. Kofi pretended to organize his brushes, but his eyes tracked her reflection in the glass. She came back the following day, and the day after that. Each time, the heavy metal door opened at the same hour. The air in the room stopped feeling stagnant. It began to move with her breathing. Kofi found himself waking up earlier, washing his face. The long, unbroken stretch of loneliness that had defined his years in Seoul fractured. It was replaced by a rhythm. He was waiting for her. The first real conversation did not happen with words, but with a brush. Kofi pointed to a stroke of ochre on the canvas, then to the gray sky outside the window. He searched for the name of the color in his own tongue, then tried to find the Korean equivalent, stumbling over the syllables. Hana watched his lips, then reached out and tapped the wood of the easel. She spoke a word he did not know, her voice low and precise. He shook his head, offering a different sound, a fragment of Lagos that felt heavy and warm. She frowned, then mimicked the shape of his mouth, trying to catch the cadence. They spent the next hour trading sounds like currency. When words failed, they used their hands. Kofi sketched a map of his home in the air, his fingers tracing the curve of a coastline she had never seen. She responded by tracing the lines of the city streets on the tabletop, showing him the cage she lived in. It was a messy, stuttering exchange. Sentences broke halfway through, abandoned for a gesture or a shared look of frustration. Yet, with every failed attempt, the distance between them narrowed. By the time the sun began to dip, they were no longer strangers struggling to speak. They were two people finding a way to be understood. They moved from the smell of turpentine to the scent of roasted beans. The cafe was crowded, but they claimed a small table in the corner, away from the flow of strangers. Kofi sat with his back to the wall, watching the door, while Hana faced him. Between them, two ceramic cups sent up thick columns of white steam. At first, they kept their elbows tucked close, guarding their own space on the wooden surface. The silence stretched, heavier than before, filled only by the clatter of spoons and the hiss of the espresso machine. Then, Hana pushed her cup forward. The dark liquid rippled, She slid a napkin across the grain of the table, stopping it just inches from Kofi's hand. On it, she had drawn a single line, jagged and broken. Kofi looked at the ink, then at her face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sketch, worn soft at the creases. He smoothed it out on the table, covering half of her napkin. His drawing showed a window looking out onto rain. He tapped the glass in the sketch, then pointed to the real window. Hana leaned in. Her shoulder brushed his arm. She did not pull away. Instead, she rested her chin on her hand. Her eyes locked on the paper, tracing the lines he had made. Hana stopped tracing the sketch. She picked up her spoon and tapped the rim of her cup, the metal ringing against the ceramic. She looked at the crowded cafe, then back at Kofi, her gaze fixed and unblinking. She took a napkin and drew a square, then filled the center with tight, overlapping lines. She pushed it toward him. She did not use words at first. She simply tapped the center of the square, then pointed to the high, glass-walled buildings visible through the cafe window. She made a motion with her hands like bars closing, then mimed the act of holding something precious, but heavy. She leaned in, her voice barely audible over the hum of the room. She called it a gilded cage. She described a life where every door was locked from the outside, where the walls were made of polished stone that felt cold to the touch. She gestured to her own wrists, then to the fine, ornate jewelry she wore, showing how it weighed her down rather than adorned her. Kofi watched her hands. He saw the tension in her fingers, the way she gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. He understood the shape of that trap. The cafe noise faded, replaced by the weight of her admission. She was not just talking about a house. She was talking about a life that had no exit. Kofi reached out, his fingers hovering near her hand, but he stopped short. He wanted to ask who held the key to that cage, who stood on the other side of those locked doors. He opened his mouth, the question ready, but the look in her eyes silenced him. She pulled her hand back, tucking it beneath the table. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She did not look at him. She looked at the entrance of the cafe, her head tilted as if listening for a sound only she could hear. She began to talk about the light in his studio, the way he captured the shadows on the subway, her voice rapid and brittle. She was building a wall of words, brick by brick, between them and the truth. She avoided the mention of her home, her life, or the man who dictated her hours. Every time Kofi tried to steer the conversation back to her reality, she shifted, her gaze darting toward the street outside. The air between them grew thin, charged with the static of things left unsaid. She grabbed her bag, her knuckles pale, and checked her watch for the third time in a minute. She was a woman living in two worlds, and she was terrified of them colliding. Kofi watched her, the unease settling in his chest like cold lead. Kofi locked the studio door behind him, the silence of the room pressing against his ears. He walked to the center of the space, his boots scuffing the floorboards. He cleared the easel of a half-finished cityscape, setting the canvas aside to face the wall. He picked up a fresh primed surface, the white texture stark under the single desk lamp. He did not reach for his usual charcoal sticks. Instead, he chose a fine-tipped brush, dipping it into a deep, muted ochre. He started with the curve of a jawline, the memory of Hana's profile guiding his hand. The first stroke was too sharp, too rigid. He wiped it away with a rag, the friction leaving a faint smudge. He closed his eyes, visualizing the way she looked when she spoke of her cage, the slight tremor in her chin, the way her gaze drifted toward the light. He opened his eyes and began again. This time, the brush moved with a rhythm he had never felt before. He layered the colors, building the shadows around her eyes with careful, deliberate pressure. He was not just painting a face, he was mapping the geography of her hidden life. The smell of acrylics filled the air, thick and grounding. He worked for hours, his hands moving in a trance, ignoring the ache in his shoulders. As the final highlight caught the light on the canvas, the image of Hana stared back at him vulnerable, trapped, and undeniably alive. Kofi stepped back, gesturing toward the easel. Hana moved closer, her breath hitching as she saw her own likeness captured in the dim light. She reached out to touch the wet paint, but her sleeve caught the edge of a water jar. It tipped, sending a splash across the workbench. She gasped, her hands flying up to catch the falling brush, but she only succeeded in knocking a tube of cobalt blue onto the floor. Kofi lunged to stop it, his boot sliding on the slick wood, and he ended up sprawled against the wall, laughing. Hana looked at the mess, then at his disheveled state, and a genuine, bright sound escaped her. It was the first time he had heard her laugh without hesitation. The sound filled the cramped studio, softening the sharp edges of the room. She wiped a smudge of blue from her thumb, her eyes crinkling at the corners. They sat there on the floor, surrounded by the chaos of their shared mistake, the weight of their separate worlds momentarily forgotten. For these few minutes, the studio was not a hiding place, but a sanctuary. They talked about the absurdity of the spill, the simple comfort of finding a common language. The echoes of their laughter died away, leaving the studio wrapped in a heavy, contemplative silence. Kofi turned his attention back to the canvas, his fingers itching for the brush. He looked at Hana, then at the painted eyes on the easel. He realized the expression was still too guarded. He dipped his brush into a mixture of charcoal gray and white, thinning the pigment until it was nearly transparent. With a steady hand, he added a subtle shadow beneath the lower lid, a tiny stroke that shifted the entire mood of the face. It was no longer just a portrait, it was a confession. He spent the next hour refining the curve of her lips, softening the tension he had previously painted there. He worked with a surgical precision, layering colors to suggest a light that seemed to emanate from within her, even as the surrounding shadows deepened. He noticed the way the light caught her cheekbones, highlighting a fragility that was usually masked by her composure. He painted that contrast, the strength in her posture against the haunting depth of her gaze. When he finally set the brush down, the painting felt like a living presence in the room. It captured a version of Hana that existed only in the quietest moments of her life. The stillness of the studio changed. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of creation, but the brittle silence of a held breath. Hana stood by the window, her hand resting on the frame. She turned her head sharply, eyes darting toward the heavy metal door. Kofi watched her, his own pulse quickening as the air in the room seemed to thin. She did not speak, but her fingers tapped a frantic, irregular rhythm against the wood. Outside, the muffled roar of the city had shifted. A siren wailed in the distance, cutting through the damp night, followed by the screech of tires on wet pavement. Hana moved away from the light, pressing herself into the shadows near the back wall. She looked at the door as if expecting it to splinter inward at any second. The sense of being watched crawled over Kofi's skin. He wiped his hands on a rag, the fabric scraping against his calloused palms, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Every shadow in the corner of the room now seemed to stretch and pulse. Hana gripped her bag, her knuckles white. She looked at Kofi, a silent warning in her gaze. The world they had kept at bay was pressing against the glass. They stood frozen, listening to the rhythm of the rain and the encroaching hum of the city, waiting for the inevitable. The silence in the room was shattered by a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards. It was not the chaotic noise of the city, but a steady, deliberate mechanical pulse. Kofi felt the tremor in his feet before he heard it. He looked toward the window, but the glass was obscured by the relentless rain. The sound grew, a deep, guttural idling that seemed to anchor itself right outside. It was a heavy, expensive engine, its exhaust note muffled yet unmistakable. Hana froze, her back pressed against the cold brick wall. She didn't look at the door. She stared at the floor, her breath hitching in her chest. On the workbench, a jar of brushes rattled against the wood. The sound of the engine was a physical weight, pressing against the thin walls, drowning out the distant sirens and the patter of the storm. The idling continued, a slow, predatory rhythm that refused to fade. Then, the engine cut out. The sudden absence of sound was louder than the noise. The studio lights flickered once, dimmed, and held. Outside, the heavy metal door of a vehicle clicked open. The sound, sharp and final. The sound of the car door closing echoed against the narrow alley walls, a sharp metallic snap that signaled the end of the wait. Footsteps followed, heavy and measured, striking the wet pavement with a rhythmic crunching sound that grew louder with every stride. Each step was deliberate, devoid of hesitation, moving toward the studio entrance with the confidence of a predator on familiar ground. Kofi watched the shadow cast by the alley light, seeing it lengthen and distort as the figure approached the threshold. Then, the movement stopped. The footsteps ceased, leaving only the soft hiss of the rain against the glass. A man stepped into the dim, flickering light of the street lamp. Park stood motionless, his face a map of jagged, white scars that caught the pale glow. His eyes were fixed on the studio door, wide and unblinking. He did not rush, he did not knock. He simply stood there, his posture rigid, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The silence he brought with him was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that filled the alley, marking the start of a confrontation. The door groaned on its hinges as Park pushed it open. He did not step inside immediately. He stood in the frame, his scarred face partially obscured by the shadows of the hallway. He turned his head slowly, his eyes sweeping across the cramped studio, taking in the stacks of canvases and the smell of drying acrylics. He moved forward, his boots clicking against the floorboards. He paused by a table, his fingers brushing against a jar of brushes, knocking it slightly askew. He did not look at the mess he made. His attention was drawn to the center of the room, where the easel stood under the harsh light of a single lamp. He stopped, his gaze locked onto the portrait of Hana. He stepped closer, his movements fluid and silent. He stared at the painted eyes, the brushstrokes that captured her likeness. A smile spread across his face, but it did not reach his eyes. He tilted his head, his dead eyes tracing the curve of the painted jawline. The air in the studio grew heavy, his fingers twitching with a sudden, sharp tension. The stillness shattered. Kofi stepped forward, his boots scraping against the floorboards as he moved to block the view of the easel. He did not speak, but his posture shifted, his shoulders squaring to defend the work. Park did not even blink. He pivoted on his heel with the speed of a striking viper, his hand lashing out before Kofi could react. Fingers clamped onto the fabric at Kofi's throat, the grip iron tight and unyielding. With a single brutal motion, Park shoved him backward. Kofi's heels caught on a loose floorboard, but the momentum was too great. He flew across the small space, his back slamming into the exposed brick wall, with a sickening thud that rattled the entire room. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, jagged gasp. He slumped, his knees buckling, but Park did not let go. He held Kofi pinned against the masonry, his face inches away, the scars on his skin standing out in the harsh light. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the threat turned into physical reality. Park's grip on the collar remained locked, but his eyes drifted away from the man he held. He looked toward the easel, his expression shifting from rage to a cold, calculated malice. He shoved Kofi aside, letting him collapse onto the floorboards with a heavy thud. Park did not look back. He walked to the center of the room, his boots crunching over discarded paint tubes and brushes. He stopped before the portrait of Hana. He traced the edge of the frame with his thumb, then curled his fingers into the canvas. The sound of the fabric failing was sharp, a jagged scream of fibers snapping under pressure. He pulled his hand downward in one fluid, savage motion. The canvas split from top to bottom, the painted face of Hana folding into distorted, shredded ribbons. He stepped back, watching the pieces sway. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the sound of Kofi's ragged breathing from the corner. Park stood amidst the ruin. Hana burst through the doorway, her movement a blur of motion against the static tension of the room. She did not stop at the threshold. She lunged forward, her hands finding the back of Park's shoulders, digging in with every ounce of her strength. She pulled, her heels sliding across the floorboards as she fought to drag him away from the corner where Kofi lay. "Stop it! Please, stop!" Her voice cracked, jagged, and loud, cutting through the heavy air of the studio. She stepped between them, her body a fragile barrier, her eyes locked onto Park's face. She did not flinch, even as he loomed over her. She grabbed his wrists, her fingers trembling but refusing to let go. She shoved him back, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. "He has nothing to do with this. Leave him alone." She was shaking, her entire frame vibrating with the intensity of her demand. Park froze, his muscles tensing under her grip. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, forcing a standoff in the wreckage of the room. Park looked at Hana, then at the shredded remains of the painting at his feet. A low, dry sound escaped his throat. It was a laugh, devoid of any humor, vibrating in the small studio like a warning. He did not strike her. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a thick, heavy stack of bills bound by a rubber band. He held it up, turning it slowly between his fingers so the light caught the edges of the paper. He looked at Kofi, who was still struggling to stand, then back at the floor. With a flick of his wrist, he let the money drop. It hit the floorboards with a dull, heavy thud, scattering across the debris of the torn canvas. The bills fanned out, landing in the dust and paint splatters. Park didn't look at the money again. He looked at them as if they were nothing more than obstacles he had just cleared from his path. He stepped over the scattered cash, his boots scuffing the paper, and turned his back on them. The silence returned, heavier than before, suffocating the room. The heavy door clicked shut, the sound vibrating through the floorboards and into their bones. Park was gone, but the air in the studio remained thick, charged with the lingering chill of his presence. Kofi pushed himself off the wall, his ribs aching with every shallow breath. He looked at the floor where the money lay, then at the shredded remains of his work. The studio felt smaller, the walls pressing in, as if the room itself were shrinking. He reached down to touch a jagged piece of canvas, but the fabric crumbled under his fingers, stained and useless. Hana stood by the window, her hands pressed against the glass, her gaze fixed on the street below. She did not turn around. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled pulse of the city outside. Every corner of the room now felt exposed. He looked at the scattered bills, then at Hana's rigid back. They were no longer just artists or dreamers. They were targets. They had to leave. The Han River Bridge stretched out like a dark, skeletal spine against the midnight sky. Wind whipped off the water, carrying the scent of damp concrete and cold iron. Kofi moved through the shadows, his boots clicking softly against the pavement. He stopped every few paces, his head turning to scan the empty road behind him. His ribs throbbed with each step, a constant reminder of the violence that had driven him here. Ahead, beneath the flickering orange glow of a single street lamp, a figure stood motionless. It was Hana. She was pressed against the cold railing, her knuckles white as she gripped a small, worn bag to her chest. Kofi approached, his pace slowing as he neared her. He did not speak. The distance between them closed, and he saw the tremor in her shoulders. They stood in the hollow silence of the bridge, two fugitives caught in the dead of night, knowing that the life they had known was already dead behind them. Hana reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, a frantic gesture of reassurance that failed to hide her shaking. The bridge was unnervingly still, the only sound the rhythmic lapping of the river far below. Kofi looked down at the bag she held, then back toward the dark expanse of the road. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. A low, guttural vibration began to hum through the concrete beneath their feet. It started as a faint tremor, then grew into a steady, rhythmic thrumming that rattled the metal railings. In the distance, two pinpricks of white light appeared, cutting through the heavy mist like twin blades. Kofi grabbed Hana by the shoulder, pulling her behind the thick stone pillar of the bridge support. The engine roar surged as a black sedan skidded to a halt, blocking their path. They had been found. The sedan doors clicked open simultaneously, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the idling engine's drone. 4 men stepped onto the pavement, their movements practiced and synchronized. They did not rush. They moved with the calculated precision of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. 2 of them fanned out toward the bridge railing, effectively cutting off any hope of a retreat toward the riverbank. The others advanced slowly, their heavy boots echoing against the concrete, creating a rhythmic, oppressive beat. The bridge, once a path to freedom, had transformed into a narrow, inescapable corridor. Kofi felt the cold stone of the pillar against his back, the rough texture biting into his skin. They were boxed in, trapped by the weight of the night and the silent, encroaching circle of men. The lead guard stopped 10 feet away, his silhouette a jagged tear in the dim light. He tilted his head, a gesture of cold curiosity. Kofi felt the wind whip across the bridge, carrying the scent of salt and exhaust. He looked at the men, Then, at the narrow gap between them, there was no path left. He shifted his weight, planting his feet firmly against the concrete. The soles of his boots scraped, a harsh sound in the quiet. He stepped out from behind the pillar, placing his body directly between Hana and the encroaching line of figures. He did not look back. He simply moved, his shoulders squaring to face the threat. He balled his hands into tight, white-knuckled fists. His knuckles ached from the tension. He had no weapon, no leverage, and no backup. He had only the raw, stubborn weight of his own resolve. The lead guard took another step, his shadow lengthening over the ground. Kofi held his ground, his breath hitching in his chest, his eyes locked onto the guard's throat. The silence between them stretched, thin and brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest provocation. Kofi did not wait for the guard to strike first. He launched himself forward, his boots skidding on the damp bridge surface as he closed the gap in a single, desperate burst of speed. He aimed a punch at the guard's face, his arm fully extended. The guard did not flinch. He simply shifted his weight, his shoulder dipping, and brought his elbow up in a short, vicious arc. The impact landed flush against Kofi's ribs with a sickening, audible crack. The air left Kofi's lungs in a sharp, involuntary wheeze. His momentum vanished instantly. He buckled, his legs losing their strength as the pain radiated through his chest like fire. He hit the concrete hard, dropping to one knee. The world tilted, the streetlights blurring into streaks of yellow light. He looked up, his vision swimming, to see the guard looming over him. He struggled to push himself back up, his fingers clawing at the rough, cold pavement. Before the guard could land the kick, a heavy, metallic clang rang out across the bridge. Hana had lunged from the shadows, swinging a discarded pipe with both hands. It struck the guard's shoulder, forcing him to stumble sideways. The impact vibrated through the air. Kofi seized the opening, pushing off the pavement with his palms, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He scrambled upright, his side burning with every movement. Hana did not stop. She swung the pipe again, a wide arc that kept the remaining men at bay. They retreated toward the bridge railing, their boots clattering on the metal grating. Behind them, the low, rhythmic pulse of sirens began to bleed into the night, growing louder with every passing second. The lead guard recovered, snarling as he reached for his belt, but he hesitated as the blue and red lights flickered against the steel beams. Kofi grabbed Hana's arm, his fingers tight, and pulled her toward the dark expanse of the river. They reached the edge, the water churning silently far below. The men slowed, their formation breaking as the sirens surged, turning the bridge into a blinding, chaotic stage. They stood at the precipice, the cold spray of the river rising to meet them. They hit the water together. The current was freezing, pulling them under before they surfaced, gasping near the dark bank. They scrambled onto the muddy shore, coughing up river water, and vanished into the shadows of the city outskirts before the police reached the bridge. The search for them eventually went cold. Months later, the noise of Seoul was replaced by the constant, rhythmic crash of waves against jagged rocks. In a small coastal cottage, the air smelled of salt and drying paint. Kofi sat on the balcony, his hands scarred from the struggle, moving a brush across a fresh canvas. The strokes were steady, deliberate, and precise. Inside, Hana sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun began to bleed orange light across the water. She did not move as the light hit her face. They lived in the quiet now, invisible to the world they had left behind. The paint dried on the canvas, a new image taking shape in the morning heat. They were safe, they were hidden, and they were finally still. The sun dipped lower, casting long, thin shadows across the wooden floor of the cottage. Kofi set his palette down on the table, the sound sharp in the stillness. He wiped his hands on a rag, the acrylic stains stubborn against his skin. He walked to the window where Hana sat. She turned, her eyes tracking the movement of the tide below. He held up the canvas, turning it so the light caught the texture of the oil. It was a portrait of the sea, layered with deep blues and sharp, jagged whites. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the surface, tracing the lines he had carved into the paint. Outside, the wind rattled the window frame, but inside, the air remained heavy and still. There were no sirens here, no heavy doors slamming shut, only the rhythm of the ocean and the smell of turpentine. He leaned against the frame, watching the horizon. He picked up the brush again, added one final stroke to the corner of the frame, and set it down for the night. Nightfall brought a chill that crept through the floorboards, but the cottage held the heat of the day. Kofi walked to the front door, his boots clicking against the wood. He slid the heavy iron bolt into place, the sound echoing through the small room. Outside, the ocean roared against the cliffs, a constant, indifferent rhythm that drowned out the memory of sirens. He turned back to the studio space. The canvases were stacked against the wall, faces of strangers staring back from the dark. He pulled a heavy linen sheet over the easel, obscuring the work he had finished. Hana stood by the stove, the flame flickering as she turned it off. The smell of tea and sea salt filled the air. She walked to the center of the room and blew out the lamp. The shadows stretched, swallowing the brushes, the paints, and the remnants of the life they had built in the city. They moved to the bedroom, leaving the studio to the silence of the coast. The first light of dawn bled across the horizon, turning the gray water into a sheet of hammered silver. Kofi sat on the balcony, his hands resting on his knees. The salt air had begun to crust on the railing, a thin white layer. Hana emerged from the bedroom, her footsteps soft on the floorboards. She stepped onto the balcony and leaned against the wood. The light hit her face, steady and warm. There was no tension in her shoulders, no darting eyes scanning the perimeter. They stood together, watching the tide pull back from the jagged rocks below. The memory of the bridge felt like a story belonging to someone else. Kofi stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony, gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. He looked back at the house, then out at the endless expanse of the sea. They had traded the neon chaos for this quiet existence. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, and for the first time, he did not look over his shoulder. The sun climbed higher, casting a sharp golden square across the studio floor. Kofi moved to the easel, his fingers tracing the texture of a fresh, blank canvas. He picked up a palette knife, scraping a small mound of ochre paint from the tube. The sound was crisp, rhythmic, and entirely his own. He applied the first stroke, a bold line that cut through the white space. Hana watched from the doorway, a mug of coffee warming her palms. She did not speak. The silence between them was no longer heavy with secrets, but light with the ease of shared time. He turned to look at her, the paint staining his thumb, and nodded. The fear that once dictated their every heartbeat had finally dissolved into the background noise of the gulls and the wind. He returned his focus to the canvas, layering color upon color. Outside, the world continued its frantic pace. But here, in the salt-drenched quiet of the coast, time moved only at the speed of his brush. They were no longer running. They were simply living, one stroke at a time, hidden in the vast blue expanse of the horizon. The past was a closed book, and today, the page was clean. Kofi wiped his hands on a rag, the streaks of blue and gold fading into the fabric. He stepped back from the easel, his boots scuffing the wooden floor. The painting was finished. He set the brush down on the table with a soft click. Hana walked over, her presence steady at his side. She looked at the canvas, then at him, and rested a hand on his shoulder. The weight of the past had been replaced by the rhythm of the tide. They walked out onto the porch, the ocean breeze cooling the air. Below them, the waves broke against the sand in a steady, unending pulse. There were no sirens, no shadows, and no doors slamming shut. They stood in the stillness, two people who had outrun the dark and found their own light. The horizon stretched out before them, vast and empty of threats. Kofi took her hand, his grip firm and relaxed. They turned away from the house and walked down toward the water, leaving the studio behind. The story was theirs now. The sand shifted beneath their feet, coarse and cool. They reached the tide line, where the foam hissed and retreated, dragging pebbles back into the deep. Kofi looked out at the vast expanse of the ocean. The horizon was a clean, sharp line, devoid of the jagged edges of the city. He breathed in the salt air, feeling the tension finally leave his shoulders. Hana stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the rising sun that turned the water into a sheet of hammered silver. They had traded the neon glare for this steady, natural pulse. There was no need to look back. The path they had walked to reach this silence was long, but it was finished. He squeezed her hand. A simple, grounding gesture. She looked up, a faint smile touching her lips, and nodded toward the distant, shimmering line where the sea met the sky. They stepped forward, their footprints quickly washed away by the incoming tide. The world behind them was a memory, distant and dim. Here, in the clarity of the morning, they were finally home. The wind carried the sound of the waves, a steady, rhythmic promise that the future was theirs to build. The sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the dunes. Kofi let go of her hand to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small, smooth stone he had found earlier. He turned it over in his palm, the surface worn down by centuries of water. It was a simple thing, yet it felt like a testament to the time they had gained. Hana watched him, her eyes reflecting the vast, blue expanse of the sea. They were no longer running. The frantic pulse of the city, the fear of the dark, and the weight of the past had dissolved into the rhythm of the tides. Every breath felt lighter, stripped of the urgency that had once defined their existence. They turned away from the shoreline, walking back toward the small cottage. Inside, the studio waited, filled with fresh canvases and the smell of sea air. There was no need for masks or secrets here. They had reached the end of the long road, finding a place where the only thing that mattered was the next sunrise. The silence was not empty. It was a sanctuary. Back in the studio, the light hit the easel at a perfect, sharp angle. Kofi picked up a brush, the bristles stiff with dried pigment. He looked at his hands, tracing the faint, jagged lines across his knuckles, the physical map of the bridge, the struggle, and the escape. He did not hide them. He dipped the brush into a deep, bruised purple and pressed it against the white surface. The stroke was steady. Beside him, Hana arranged wildflowers in a ceramic jar, the stems clicking softly against the clay. She moved with a grace that had been absent in the city, her focus entirely on the present. Kofi watched her for a heartbeat, then turned back to the canvas, capturing the exact shade of the morning sky. Every movement was deliberate, a quiet declaration of their autonomy. They were no longer defined by the threats that had chased them across the country. The studio was quiet, save for the rhythmic scrape of the brush and the distant, constant hum of the ocean. He finished the final detail, stepped back, and set the brush down. The painting was complete. It was not a record of their pain, but a testament to the life they had reclaimed. Outside, the sun began its slow descent, painting the horizon in gold. The evening air cooled, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth through the open window. Kofi placed his palette on the table, the colors now muted in the fading light. He walked to the balcony where Hana stood, her gaze fixed on the first stars appearing above the dark silhouette of the cliffs. She turned as he approached, a faint smile touching her lips. There was no need for words. The long, jagged path that had led them from the neon-lit alleys to this quiet shore had finally reached its horizon. Below, the tide pulled away from the sand, a rhythmic, steady sound that anchored them to the earth. Kofi leaned against the railing, his hands resting beside hers. They watched the darkness deepen, but it felt different now. The door closed softly behind them, sealing away the past. Their story had found its peace. The morning sun climbed over the horizon, flooding the small cottage with a warm, steady glow. Kofi stood by the easel, his gaze lingering on the canvas one last time before he wiped his brushes clean. The paint was dry, the colors fixed, a permanent record of the transition from chaos to stillness. Hana walked in from the balcony, holding 2 steaming mugs, the ceramic warm against her palms. She set one down near the window and stood beside him, watching the light dance across the surface of his work. They did not speak of the bridge, the sirens, or the cold faces that once haunted their nights. Kofi reached out, his fingers brushing against the frame, feeling the solid, unmoving reality of their home. The story had reached its end, not with a shout, but with the quiet, persistent hum of a life reclaimed. The sun reached its zenith, casting sharp, clear shadows across the wooden floorboards of the cottage. Kofi stepped back from the canvas, his work finally complete. He set his brush down, the bristles stiff with dried pigment, and walked to the threshold. Hana was already there, her eyes tracking the movement of the gulls circling above the surf. She turned to him, her expression steady, free from the tremors that once defined their nights in the city. They stood together in the doorway, the boundary between their past and their present. The memories of the bridge and the cold, dark streets were now just echoes. Kofi took her hand, his fingers tracing the faint lines of her palm, a map of their shared survival. They were no longer running. They were simply here, anchored by the light of a morning that promised nothing but the next hour. The masterpiece was the life they had carved out of the silence. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the sea, they stepped out into the warmth, leaving the last of their ghosts behind in the fading shadows of the room. The tide pulled back, leaving the sand smooth and unmarked. Kofi watched the water retreat, his hands resting at his sides, no longer reaching for a brush or a tool. The work was done. The studio was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of the waves. Hana leaned against the doorframe, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky met the sea in a seamless line of blue. They had found the stillness they once thought impossible. There were no more sirens, no more shadows, and no more need to look over their shoulders. The life they had built here was a quiet testament to their resolve. Every sunrise was a promise kept, every sunset a victory earned. As the last of the daylight dipped below the water, the world felt vast, open, and entirely their own. They turned away from the balcony and stepped inside, closing the door on the past for good. They were home. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more powerful journeys.